A man stands in a laboratory in 1890, staring at a human brain, preserved in formaldehyde, and suddenly realizes he has no idea whether his own thoughts are real or just chemical reactions. That man is William James, and the question he's grappling with will birth American psychology, redefine philosophy, and force an entire generation to confront an unsettling possibility. Maybe consciousness is stranger than anyone imagined. January 11th, 1842. Henry James Sr. paces the floor of his New York City townhouse on Washington Place, waiting. His wife Mary gives birth upstairs, and when the midwife finally brings down the child, Henry holds his firstborn son and names him William. The father has no idea he's just welcomed into the world someone who will become one of the most influential thinkers America ever produces. But before brilliance comes chaos. Before the psychology textbooks and the lectures at Harvard, there's a young man so paralyzed by indecision that he can't choose a career, so consumed by depression that he contemplates suicide, so obsessed with free will that he conducts an experiment on himself just to see if choice is real. The James family was wealthy, but wealth came with complications. Henry Sr. had inherited a fortune from his own father, William James of Albany, one of the richest men in America. That grandfather was a stern Presbyterian businessman who'd built an empire through ruthless discipline. When he died in 1832, he left an estate worth millions, but he structured his will to prevent his son Henry from squandering it. The will essentially said, "You're too impractical to be trusted." Henry Sr. proved the old man right in the most spectacular way possible. He didn't squander the money on gambling or drink. He squandered it on ideas. Henry became obsessed with theology, with Swedenborgianism, with mystical visions of spiritual reality. He wrote dense, unreadable books about the relationship between God and man. He held salons in his home, where transcendentalists and spiritualists gathered to discuss the nature of the soul. Ralph Waldo Emerson was a family friend. So was Henry David Thoreau. This was the atmosphere young William breathed. Not the atmosphere of business and practical success, but of endless intellectual debate, of questions that had no answers, of ideas pursued for their own sake, regardless of utility. The family moved constantly. Henry Sr. believed that children should be exposed to culture, to art, to the widest possible range of human experience. So William's childhood became a whirlwind of displacement. New York, then London, then Paris, then Geneva, then back to America, then to Europe again. By the time William was 12, he'd attended more schools than most people attend in a lifetime. There was no stability, no consistent curriculum, no chance to form lasting friendships, just a constant rotation of tutors, languages, museums, and strange new cities where nothing felt permanent. Henry Sr.'s educational philosophy was simple: never let the children settle into anything conventional. He pulled William out of school whenever he sensed the boy was becoming too comfortable. He switched tutors on a whim. He moved the entire family across the Atlantic multiple times, based purely on intuition about where the children would receive the best impressions. Mary, William's mother, held the chaos together through sheer force of will. While Henry pursued his mystical theories, she managed the household, the finances, the endless logistics of moving 5 children across continents. She was practical, where Henry was abstract, grounded where he floated in intellectual clouds. William was the oldest, and he felt the weight of that position. His brother Henry, born 15 months later, would become the famous novelist Henry James. 2 other brothers, Garth Wilkinson and Robertson, would fight in the Civil War. The youngest, Alice, would become a diarist whose posthumously published journal revealed a mind as sharp as her brother's, trapped in a body that medicine couldn't help, and a society that had no use for brilliant women. By adolescence, William was showing talent in art. He could draw with remarkable skill, capturing not just the appearance of things, but their essence. He loved painting, loved the way visual representation could convey truths that words couldn't reach. At 17, he told his father he wanted to become a painter. Henry Sr. was horrified. Painting was fine as an accomplishment, but as a profession? For the heir to a philosophical dynasty? Unthinkable. Yet the old man's philosophy trapped him. How could he forbid William from pursuing his passion when his entire educational approach was built on following one's authentic impulses? So in 1858, the family moved to Newport, Rhode Island, specifically so William could study with William Morris Hunt, one of America's leading painters. For a year, William immersed himself in art. He worked in Hunt's studio, learned technique, began to develop a style, and then he stopped. Not because his father forced him, but because he realized something about himself. He was good at painting, maybe even very good. But the greatest artists possessed something he didn't, some capacity for absolute commitment, for pouring themselves completely into visual expression. William's mind wouldn't stay still long enough. He kept thinking about philosophy, about science, about questions that painting couldn't answer. The decision to abandon art haunted him for years. He would always wonder, did I quit because I lacked the ultimate talent, or because I lacked the courage to commit? Was it wisdom or cowardice? With painting abandoned, the question became, what now? Henry Sr. pushed for something respectable, something intellectual. In 1861, at 19, William enrolled at Harvard to study chemistry. Chemistry lasted 1 year. The problem wasn't the subject, but William himself. He couldn't commit. He kept questioning whether this was the right path, whether he should be studying something else, whether any choice he made was the correct one. He switched to comparative anatomy and physiology, studying under Louis Agassiz, the great naturalist who believed species were separately created by God, and that Darwin's evolutionary theory was dangerous nonsense. The Civil War raged. William's younger brothers enlisted. Garth Wilkinson was wounded at Fort Wagner, leading black troops in one of the war's bloodiest assaults. Robertson also served. William did not. He stayed at Harvard conducting dissections, examining specimens, and drowning in guilt. Why wasn't he fighting? Was it because of his health, his mysterious back problems and digestive issues that doctors couldn't diagnose? Or was he simply a coward, hiding behind intellectual pursuits while better men died? In 1864, he entered Harvard Medical School. Medicine seemed practical, seemed useful, seemed like something his mind could finally settle on. But within months, the same restlessness returned. He didn't want to be a doctor. He wanted to understand the fundamental questions: what is life? What is consciousness? How does the physical brain produce the phenomenon of thought? Medical school ground forward. William passed his courses but found no joy in them. His health deteriorated. The back pain worsened. His eyes troubled him. He developed digestive problems that left him weak and nauseated. Doctors examined him and found nothing physically wrong, which only deepened his despair. If nothing was wrong, why did he feel so terrible? In 1865, he made a desperate decision. He would join Louis Agassiz's expedition to Brazil. The renowned naturalist was leading a scientific journey to collect specimens from the Amazon, and William volunteered. Maybe physical adventure would cure his psychological paralysis. Maybe the jungle would burn away his indecision. The Brazil expedition was a disaster. The physical demands proved overwhelming for someone with William's fragile health. The heat was unbearable. The insects were torture. He contracted smallpox and nearly died. Worse, he discovered that he had no passion for fieldwork. Collecting specimens, cataloguing animals, the practical work of natural history bored him. He wanted to think about what life meant, not just document its variety. He returned to Harvard in 1866, more lost than when he'd left. Medical school resumed, but now it felt like a prison sentence. He attended lectures, took exams, went through the motions while his mind spiraled into darker territories. Then in April 1867, he made another escape attempt. He would go to Germany, the center of scientific research, and study physiology at its source. Maybe European universities would offer what Harvard couldn't. Maybe distance from his family would provide clarity. Germany provided neither. William enrolled at the University of Berlin, attended some lectures, but mostly wandered through an internal wasteland. His German was poor. His health was worse. The back pain became so severe he could barely sit through a lecture. His eyes deteriorated to the point where reading was agony. He travelled to Dresden hoping a change of scene would help. It didn't. He tried various spa treatments, the fashionable cure-all of the era. Nothing worked. By 1868, he was in a full psychological collapse. He couldn't work, he couldn't read, he could barely function. His letters home became desperate. He wrote to his father about feeling trapped in his own mind, about questioning whether life had any meaning, about wondering whether he should simply end it all. Henry Sr., despite his mystical abstractions, responded with love and financial support, urging William to take whatever time he needed to recover. But recover into what? That was the question William couldn't answer. He wasn't a painter, he wasn't a naturalist, he didn't want to be a doctor. He had no career, no purpose, no direction. At 26 years old, he was a failure living on his father's money in a German boarding house, too sick to work and too paralysed by doubt to choose a path forward. The crisis came to a head in the winter of 1870, back in America, in his parents' house in Cambridge. William was 28, unemployed, living with his family, and sinking into a darkness that threatened to consume him completely. He read philosophy obsessively, particularly the determinists, who argued that free will was an illusion. If every action is caused by prior events, if the universe operates according to fixed natural laws, then choice is impossible. We're all just machines running programs written by physics and chemistry. The feeling of decision is an illusion generated by a brain that doesn't realise it's just following mechanical rules. This terrified William on a visceral level. If determinism was true, then his entire crisis of indecision was predetermined. His suffering wasn't a problem to solve, but an inevitable outcome of prior causes stretching back to the beginning of time. He couldn't choose to get better because choice itself didn't exist. Then he encountered the philosopher Charles Renouvier, whose work argued that free will could be defended rationally, that the universe wasn't necessarily a closed mechanical system. Renouvier claimed that attention itself was proof of freedom, the ability to hold one thought in mind rather than another, to focus here instead of there, demonstrated that consciousness could act independently of mechanical causation. William seized on this idea like a drowning man grabbing a rope. He decided to perform an experiment. He would test whether free will existed by exercising it. On April 30th, 1870, he wrote in his diary, "I think that yesterday was a crisis in my life. I finished the first part of Renouvier's second essay and see no reason why his definition of free will, the sustaining of a thought because I choose to when I might have other thoughts, need be the definition of an illusion. My first act of free will shall be to believe in free will." It was a philosophical argument deployed as a weapon against despair. He wouldn't passively wait to see if free will existed. He would act as if it did, and by acting, bring it into being. The logic was circular, absurd even, but William didn't care. He needed something to hold on to, and this was it. The decision didn't cure him immediately. Depression doesn't evaporate because you write something in a diary, but it gave him a foothold, a way to conceptualize his suffering that didn't lead straight to nihilism. If he could choose to believe in free will, then he could choose other things. He could choose to get out of bed. He could choose to take a walk. He could choose to read for an hour instead of lying in darkness. Each tiny decision became evidence that the universe wasn't entirely predetermined. Slowly, across months, William began to stabilize. He started writing reviews and essays for philosophical journals, testing out ideas, developing his voice. Harvard offered him a position teaching physiology in 1872. He wasn't passionate about physiology, but it was employment, structure, a reason to leave the house. He accepted. Then in 1875, Harvard asked if he'd teach a new course, psychology. The field barely existed yet as an independent discipline. It was still tangled up with philosophy and physiology, not quite science, not quite speculation. William said yes. He had no formal training in psychology. No one did. The field was so new that expertise meant having read the right books and thought hard about consciousness. William had definitely done that. He set up a small demonstration laboratory in Lawrence Hall. Nothing fancy, just some equipment for showing students how sensory perception worked. But it was enough. In 1876, William James became one of the first people in America to teach psychology as a subject distinct from moral philosophy. His students loved him. Where other Harvard professors lectured in formal academic prose, William talked like a human being. He used metaphors, jokes, vivid examples. He admitted when he didn't know something. He encouraged disagreement. His lectures felt like conversations, explorations rather than pronouncements. One student described him as treating ideas like living things that needed to be poked and prodded to see if they were really alive. But William still hadn't written anything major. He'd published essays and reviews, contributed to journals, built a reputation as a brilliant teacher and sharp critic. Yet there was no book, no systematic statement of his philosophy. Publishers kept asking, William kept promising, and then doing nothing. In 1878, he signed a contract with Henry Holt and Company to write a psychology textbook. He estimated it would take 2 years. It took 12. The delay wasn't laziness. William couldn't figure out what he actually believed about consciousness. Every time he started writing, he'd encounter a problem that required rethinking everything. He'd chase down that problem, read more, think more, then discover 3 new problems branching off the first. His perfectionism was paralyzing. Meanwhile, his personal life was changing. In 1878, he married Alice Howe Gibbons, a schoolteacher he'd met in Boston. Alice was intelligent, practical, emotionally stable, everything William needed. She managed the household, handled finances, and gave William the domestic foundation that allowed him to work. They had 5 children together, though William remained perpetually anxious about money, about providing, about whether he was a good father. The book kept expanding. What started as a straightforward textbook became something else, a massive investigation into the nature of consciousness itself. William was trying to understand the mind from the inside, to describe what thinking actually feels like, rather than constructing abstract theories about cognitive mechanisms. He wanted psychology to be empirical, grounded in observable experience, but also faithful to the richness and complexity of conscious life. Finally, in 1890, after 12 years of writing and rewriting, The Principles of Psychology was published. 2 volumes, nearly 1,400 pages. It was immediately recognized as a masterpiece. The writing was vivid and literary, nothing like the dry academic prose that dominated philosophy. William described consciousness not as a collection of separate mental atoms, but as a stream, a continuous flow of experience where thoughts blend into each other without clear boundaries. The stream of consciousness. That phrase, which would later be adopted by novelists like Virginia Woolf and James Joyce, came from William's attempt to describe what thinking is actually like. Thoughts don't arrive as discrete units. They flow, merge, change. One thought shades into another. Memory blends with perception. Emotion colours cognition. The mind isn't a machine processing information. It's a river, always moving, never the same twice. William also introduced the distinction between the self as subject and the self as object. The I that experiences and the me that is experienced. When you think about yourself, there's a part of you doing the thinking and a part that's being thought about. These aren't two separate entities, but two aspects of a single process. Consciousness has this strange reflexive quality where it can loop back and observe itself, but the observer is also part of what's being observed. The book made William famous. It became the standard psychology text in America and remained so for decades. Students who'd never heard of him suddenly knew his name. Colleagues who'd dismissed him as a talented dilettante had to reconsider. At 48 years old, William James had finally produced the major work everyone had been waiting for. But he was already moving beyond psychology. The questions that really obsessed him weren't about perception or memory. They were about belief, truth, meaning, and whether anything we think actually corresponds to reality. He was becoming a philosopher, not of abstract systems but of lived experience. In 1896, he delivered a lecture at Berkeley titled The Will to Believe. It was a defense of faith, but not the kind religious apologists usually offered. William wasn't arguing that God's existence could be proven or that religious doctrine was rationally compelling. He was arguing something stranger and more pragmatic. Some questions can't be settled by evidence alone. When you're facing a decision where the evidence is genuinely ambiguous, where rational analysis doesn't yield a clear answer, you still have to choose. Refusing to choose is itself a choice. And in those situations, William argued, it's legitimate to let your passions, your hopes, your sense of what would make life meaningful tip the balance. Critics called this wishful thinking. William called it honest. If you're standing at a fork in the road and both paths disappear into fog, picking the path that leads towards something you value isn't irrational. It's the only rational response. Pretending you can wait for more evidence when the choice can't be delayed is self-deception. The lecture was controversial. Philosophers accused him of abandoning intellectual rigor. Religious believers weren't sure whether he was defending faith or undermining it by making it optional, but William didn't care. He was trying to carve out space for human agency in a universe that seemed increasingly determined by mechanical laws. This became the foundation of pragmatism, the philosophical movement William would champion for the rest of his life. The core idea was simple but radical. Truth isn't about correspondence between ideas and some abstract reality we can never directly access. Truth is what works. An idea is true if believing it leads to successful action, if it helps you navigate experience, if it makes predictions that pan out. This sounds relativistic, like truth is just whatever you want it to be. But William was more subtle than that. Ideas have to work in practice, in the actual world, tested against real consequences. You can't just believe anything. Reality pushes back. The question is whether your beliefs help you engage with that pushback effectively or leave you confused and helpless. In 1898, William gave a lecture at Berkeley titled Philosophical Conceptions and Practical Results, which introduced pragmatism to a wider audience. He credited Charles Sanders Peirce, a brilliant but difficult philosopher who'd first articulated the pragmatic maxim in the 1870s. Peirce had argued that the meaning of any concept is found in its practical effects. If two ideas produce identical consequences in experience, they don't actually differ in meaning, no matter how different they sound. William took this principle and ran with it in directions Peirce never intended. He applied it to religion, morality, metaphysics, to all the grand questions philosophy had been debating for centuries. What difference does it make whether the universe is fundamentally material or spiritual? What changes in your actual experience if one is true rather than the other? If the answer is nothing, then the debate is meaningless, just words chasing words. But if believing the universe is spiritual rather than material makes you treat people differently, gives you reasons to act that you wouldn't otherwise have, changes how you face suffering or death, then the question has genuine meaning, not because one answer corresponds to metaphysical reality, but because the choice between them has practical consequences. This drove his more traditional colleagues to distraction. They accused him of confusing truth with usefulness, of reducing philosophy to mere instrumentalism. William kept pushing. He wrote essays, gave lectures, refined his arguments. In 1906, he delivered the Lowell Lectures in Boston, which were published the following year as Pragmatism, a new name for some old ways of thinking. The book was written for a general audience, not specialists. William used everyday language, concrete examples, humour. He wanted philosophy to escape the academy and address real human concerns. The book became a bestseller, rare for a philosophy text. Suddenly, pragmatism was everywhere, debated in newspapers, discussed in salons, taught in universities. Critics multiplied along with readers. Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher, attacked pragmatism as intellectually dishonest, a way of believing comfortable lies rather than facing uncomfortable truths. G.E. Moore accused William of conflating truth with verification. European philosophers dismissed the whole movement as typically American, practical, and shallow, lacking the depth of German idealism or British empiricism. William fought back in essays and lectures, but he was also evolving. His later work moved toward what he called radical empiricism, an attempt to take experience seriously in all its dimensions. Not just sensory data, but relations, connections, the felt sense of continuity between moments. Empiricism had traditionally focused on discrete impressions, atoms of experience. William wanted an empiricism that acknowledged the connective tissue, the and but, and therefore, that link impressions into a coherent stream. His health was declining again. Heart problems that had plagued him intermittently for years were getting worse. He tired easily, suffered chest pains, had to limit his activities, but he kept working, driven by the sense that he hadn't yet said what he most needed to say. In 1909, he published A Pluralistic Universe, based on lectures he'd given at Oxford. The book argued against monism, the idea that reality is fundamentally one unified whole. William believed the universe was genuinely plural, messy, unfinished, full of real alternatives and possibilities. Things could go different ways. The future wasn't fixed. Novelty was real, not illusory. This wasn't just metaphysics, it was personal. The idea that reality is open, that genuine alternatives exist, that choices matter because they create rather than merely reveal outcomes. This was the philosophical expression of the insight that had saved him during his breakdown 40 years earlier. Free will wasn't an illusion. The universe was loose enough, indeterminate enough, that consciousness could make a difference. He was racing now against his failing body, trying to complete one more book, the work that would tie everything together. Some Problems of Philosophy was supposed to be his systematic statement, the comprehensive vision he'd never quite articulated. But his heart wouldn't cooperate. In the summer of 1910, William travelled to Europe one last time, seeking treatment, seeing friends, knowing it was probably goodbye. He returned to his summer home in Chocorua, New Hampshire, in August. His heart was giving out. He could barely walk. Alice cared for him constantly. His children gathered. On August 26, 1910, William James died at home, with Alice beside him. He was 68 years old. His last words, according to Alice, were about his unfinished work. He'd wanted more time, more pages, one final statement that would make everything clear. Instead, philosophy lost the man who'd insisted it should matter to ordinary life. The funeral was small, private, held at the family summer home. No grand memorial service in a university chapel. No procession through Cambridge with academic regalia. Just family and close friends gathering to say goodbye to someone they'd loved. Not the famous philosopher, but the man himself, restless and generous and perpetually curious. News of his death spread quickly. Obituaries appeared in newspapers across America and Europe. Harvard lowered its flags. Philosophical societies issued statements, but the tributes were strangely divided. Some celebrated him as America's greatest philosopher. Others damned him with faint praise, acknowledging his influence while quietly suggesting his ideas wouldn't last. The British idealists who dominated philosophy for decades breathed easier. Pragmatism had seemed dangerous, a populist revolt against serious metaphysics. With William gone, perhaps the whole movement would fade. American philosophy could return to proper idealism, to absolutes and certainties and systematic completeness. They were wrong. John Dewey was just hitting his stride. He'd take pragmatism in directions William never imagined, applying it to education, democracy, social reform. Dewey would live until 1952, spending 5 more decades developing and defending ideas that began in conversations with William back in the 1890s. Charles Peirce outlived William by only 4 years, dying in 1914, still obscure, still convinced that William had misunderstood pragmatism and popularized a distortion. Peirce's papers, thousands of pages of brilliant, difficult manuscripts, sat in trunks unpublished. Decades later, scholars would discover them and realize that Peirce had anticipated developments in logic, semiotics, and philosophy of science that wouldn't emerge in mainstream philosophy until mid-century. But in 1910, what mattered was the void William left. Philosophy had lost its most public voice, the man who'd convinced thousands of readers that philosophical questions weren't academic puzzles, but urgent human concerns. Alice gathered William's papers, sorting through decades of manuscripts, lecture notes, correspondence. She found the incomplete Some Problems of Philosophy and decided to publish it anyway, unfinished as it was. The book appeared in 1911 with a note explaining that William had intended to say more, but ran out of time. Readers could glimpse where he'd been heading, even if he never arrived. His other books stayed in print. The Principles of Psychology remained the standard text for decades. The Varieties of Religious Experience found new audiences in each generation, speaking to anyone who'd ever wondered whether spiritual experience might be real. Pragmatism kept selling, kept getting assigned in philosophy courses, kept provoking arguments. The arguments intensified during World War I. Pragmatism's critics saw the war as proof that ideas have consequences, that relativism leads to catastrophe. If truth is just what works, if there are no absolute standards, then Germany's militarism could claim to be true for Germans. The whole pragmatist project seemed suddenly dangerous. Dewey fought back, arguing that pragmatism actually provided the strongest defense of democracy, precisely because it rejected authoritarianism and dogmatism. Democracy works not because it embodies eternal truth, but because it's a method for solving problems collectively, for testing ideas against experience, for revising beliefs when they fail. By the 1920s, American philosophy was fragmenting. Some thinkers followed Dewey's path towards social and political philosophy. Others moved toward logical analysis, inspired by new developments in mathematical logic coming from Europe. The unity William had briefly created, the sense of a distinctively American philosophical movement, was dissolving. Then came the logical positivists, refugees from Europe in the 1930s, bringing a radically different approach. Philosophy should be scientific, precise, mathematical. Metaphysics was meaningless. Ethics was just emotion dressed up as argument. The whole pragmatist emphasis on lived experience and practical consequences seemed hopelessly fuzzy. For a while, pragmatism looked dead. Universities hired positivists and analysts. Graduate students learned formal logic and linguistic analysis. William's books gathered dust on library shelves, assigned less frequently, cited mainly as historical curiosities. But ideas don't die easily, especially when they address permanent human concerns. By the 1970s, cracks appeared in the positivist consensus. The dream of reducing all knowledge to formal systems and observation statements had failed. Philosophy was messier than that, more entangled with history and culture and human purposes. A revival began. Richard Rorty, trained in analytic philosophy but increasingly dissatisfied with its narrowness, wrote Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature in 1979. The book attacked the whole idea that philosophy's job is to find secure foundations for knowledge. Instead, Rorty argued, philosophy should be a conversation, a way of coping with problems, an instrument for achieving human purposes. This was pragmatism reborn, though Rorty drew as much from European thinkers like Heidegger and Derrida as from William and Dewey. Critics accused him of betraying philosophy, of reducing it to literature or politics. Rorty responded that philosophy had always been those things. The pretense of standing outside culture and history was the real betrayal. Hilary Putnam, one of the greatest analytic philosophers, moved steadily toward pragmatism over his career. He argued that the dichotomy between facts and values was false, that observation is theory-laden, that truth can't be separated from justification. These were Jamesian themes, though Putnam arrived at them through technical work in philosophy of science and mathematics. Suddenly William was relevant again. New editions of his books appeared. Scholars wrote studies exploring his arguments in contemporary terms. Philosophy departments that had ignored pragmatism for decades started hiring specialists in American philosophy. What they discovered was that William had anticipated concerns that seemed cutting edge. His pluralism, his insistence that reality might be genuinely multiple and messy, resonated with postmodern skepticism about grand unified theories. His emphasis on the practical consequences of belief as aligned with the growing sense that knowledge is inseparable from power and social context. His radical empiricism, taking experience seriously in all its dimensions, spoke to phenomenologists trying to describe consciousness without reducing it to brain states or behavioral dispositions. Even his flaws seemed instructive. His vagueness, his refusal to define terms precisely, his tendency to argue through examples rather than formal proofs. These weren't just stylistic quirks. They reflected a conviction that philosophy's job isn't to achieve final certainty, but to clarify problems, open possibilities, help people think more flexibly about their options. Contemporary neuroscience vindicated aspects of his psychology. The brain doesn't passively receive information and construct representations. It actively predicts, constantly generating hypotheses and testing them against incoming data. Perception is pragmatic, shaped by what works for survival and action, not by correspondence to some observer-independent reality. His theory of emotion, dismissed for decades as obviously wrong, found new defenders. Antonio Damasio's research on patients with brain damage affecting emotion showed that feelings aren't obstacles to rationality, but necessary for it. People who can't feel emotion can't make decisions, paralyzed by the inability to care about outcomes. This was exactly what William had argued. Emotion and cognition are inseparable, both essential to intelligent behavior. Religious scholars continued grappling with the varieties of religious experience. Was William defending religion or explaining it away? He seemed to be doing both, taking mystical experiences seriously as data while remaining agnostic about their ultimate source. This ambiguity frustrated readers who wanted clear answers, but reflected William's genuine uncertainty about the deepest questions. His influence spread beyond philosophy and psychology. Writers and artists found inspiration in his ideas. Gertrude Stein, who'd studied with William at Radcliffe, brought pragmatist themes into her experimental fiction. The stream of consciousness technique in modernist literature owed something to William's description of thought as fluid and continuous, rather than made up of discrete ideas. Legal scholars discovered pragmatism's relevance to jurisprudence. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., a friend of William's, argued that law isn't the discovery of pre-existing principles, but a tool for achieving social purposes. Legal reasoning is pragmatic, weighing consequences, adapting to changing circumstances. This view, once radical, became mainstream in American legal thought. Educators kept returning to Dewey's pragmatist philosophy of education, which emphasized learning by doing, connecting classroom lessons to real-world problems, treating students as active inquirers rather than passive recipients. Progressive education faced backlash repeatedly, but its core insights, derived from pragmatism, kept resurfacing. By the early 21st century, pragmatism had become one of the major traditions in philosophy, studied and debated alongside rationalism, empiricism, idealism, and phenomenology. Universities offered courses on American pragmatism. Scholarly conferences explored connections between pragmatism and other movements. The internet age brought new interest in William's pluralism, his acceptance of multiple perspectives, his skepticism about final answers. Yet something essential about William remained elusive. You could study his arguments, trace his influence, map his intellectual development, and still miss what made him matter to the people who knew him. He wasn't just a collection of theories. He was a presence, a way of being in the world, someone who made philosophy feel urgent and alive. His letters reveal this better than his published work. Thousands survive, written to family, friends, students, colleagues, strangers who'd written him with questions. He took everyone seriously, responding thoughtfully even to confused undergraduates and amateur philosophers. The letters are warm, funny, sometimes raw with emotion. You see someone struggling genuinely with ideas, not performing expertise. Alice lived until 1922, spending her final years organising William's papers and protecting his reputation. Their children scattered into their own lives. Henry James III became a lawyer. William Jr. struggled with alcohol and never found a stable career. Margaret married and had children. Alexander became an artist. The house in Cambridge became a private residence again, no longer a gathering place for philosophers and psychologists. The furniture William had sat in, the desk where he'd written, the books he'd owned, these dispersed to various owners and institutions. What remained was harder to locate in physical space. Ideas don't live in houses or books exactly. They live in minds that grapple with them, in arguments that never quite conclude, in questions that keep demanding new answers. William understood this. He'd written once that the point of philosophy isn't to solve problems permanently, but to keep the conversation going, to prevent thought from freezing into dogma. The conversation continues. Philosophers still argue about truth, consciousness, free will, the relationship between mind and world. The terms have changed, the technical apparatus has grown more sophisticated, but the fundamental puzzles remain. And whenever someone insists that philosophy should matter to how we live, that ideas have consequences, that thinking is a form of action in the world, William's ghost hovers nearby, nodding approval. He wanted philosophy to be useful, but he knew usefulness is complicated. Not everything valuable produces immediate, practical results. Some ideas work slowly, changing how we see rather than what we do. Some truths we need even if they don't make us happier or more successful. This tension between pragmatism's emphasis on consequences and the recognition that some things matter regardless of outcomes was never fully resolved. Maybe it can't be. Maybe the point is to hold both thoughts together, to be practical without being merely instrumental, to value truth without pretending we can escape our human perspective on it. That's what William left behind. Not a system or a doctrine, but an approach, a temperament, a way of holding philosophy lightly while taking it seriously. The examined life he'd inherited from Socrates filtered through American democratic culture, transformed into something restless and pluralistic and forever unfinished. The man who couldn't decide whether to be a scientist or a philosopher ended up showing that the distinction was false. Thinking is empirical, observation is theoretical, facts and values interpenetrate. We can't step outside our experience to judge it from nowhere. We're always inside, embedded, trying to make sense of a world that doesn't come pre-interpreted. This was William's deepest insight, the one that unified everything else. We're not spectators of reality, but participants in it. And our thinking is part of what makes the world what it becomes. The pragmatist movement William helped create didn't survive intact. Movements rarely do. They fragment, evolve, get absorbed into other traditions, or rejected entirely. What happened to pragmatism after William's death is a story of transformation, near extinction, and unexpected resurrection. Charles Sanders Peirce, the brilliant, difficult man who'd coined the term pragmatism, died in poverty in 1914, his work largely unpublished and unknown. He'd been too strange, too uncompromising, too far ahead of his time. William had supported him financially for years, arranging lectures, sending money, trying to get his essays published. It hadn't been enough. Peirce died in obscurity, his vast manuscripts scattered and unread. Only decades later would philosophers realize what they'd missed, a logical and semiotic genius whose ideas anticipated developments in philosophy of science, linguistics, and cognitive theory. John Dewey became pragmatism's public face. He outlived William by 40 years, dying in 1952 at 92, and during those decades he transformed pragmatism into a comprehensive philosophy of democracy, education, and social reform. Dewey wasn't interested in consciousness or religious experience, the topics that had obsessed William. He cared about schools, politics, labour unions, how philosophy could reshape society. His pragmatism was activist, collective, focused on institutions rather than individual experience. The split was temperamental as much as philosophical. William was an individualist, Dewey a communitarian. William wrote about saints and mystics, Dewey about democracy and education. William's prose sparkled with metaphor and personal voice. Dewey's was dense, systematic, earnest to the point of dullness. They respected each other, but inhabited different intellectual worlds. By the 1920s, pragmatism dominated American philosophy departments. It was the native philosophy, homegrown, distinctively American. European visitors found it crude and unsophisticated, lacking the rigour of German idealism or the precision of British empiricism. American philosophers didn't care. They were building something new, a philosophy suited to a democratic experimental society. Then came the crash, not financial, though the Great Depression mattered. The intellectual crash, the sudden reversal that nearly erased pragmatism from serious philosophy. Logical positivism arrived from Europe in the 1930s, brought by refugees fleeing fascism. Rudolf Carnap, Hans Reichenbach, Karl Hempel. These philosophers had a very different vision. Philosophy should be scientific, rigorous, mathematical. Statements must be verifiable, or they're meaningless. Metaphysics is nonsense, ethics is emotion, disguised as argument. The goal is clarity, precision, logical analysis. Pragmatism looked sloppy by comparison, too vague, too willing to blur distinctions, too comfortable with ambiguity. The positivists dismissed it as a phase American philosophy needed to outgrow on its way to genuine sophistication. By the 1950s, pragmatism was nearly dead in academic philosophy. Dewey's influence remained in education theory, but philosophers had moved on. Analytic philosophy, descended from logical positivism, dominated. The questions changed. Instead of asking how ideas work in experience, philosophers analysed the logic of language, the structure of scientific theories, the meaning of meaning itself. William James became a historical figure, important but past. His books stayed in print but weren't assigned much in philosophy courses. Psychologists claimed him as a founder, but focused on his empirical work, not his philosophy. The principles of psychology remained a classic, but the varieties of religious experience and pragmatism gathered dust. Then something unexpected happened. Philosophy ate itself. Logical positivism's verification principle, the core doctrine that statements must be empirically verifiable to be meaningful, turned out to be self-refuting. The principle itself couldn't be verified empirically. It was a metaphysical claim, dressed up as anti-metaphysics. The whole edifice started crumbling in the 1960s. Willard Van Orman Quine, a Harvard philosopher working in the analytic tradition, published essays that sounded surprisingly pragmatist. His famous paper, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, attacked the analytic synthetic distinction that positivists had relied on. Quine argued that our beliefs form a web, with experience pressing on the edges, but no sharp line between observation and theory. We adjust our beliefs pragmatically, keeping what works, revising what doesn't. This was William's radical empiricism by another name. Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, in 1962, described science as a social practice, shaped by paradigms that shift for reasons that aren't purely logical. Scientists work within frameworks that determine what counts as evidence, what problems matter, what solutions are acceptable. When paradigms shift, it's not just because new data accumulates, it's a gestalt switch, a change in how scientists see their field. This was pragmatism applied to history of science. Richard Rorty made the connection explicit. His Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature in 1979 was a full-throated pragmatist manifesto, arguing that philosophy should give up trying to ground knowledge in foundations, whether empirical or rational. We should accept that we're always working within human practices and vocabularies, with no God's eye view available. Truth is what works in the long run for a community of inquirers. Reality doesn't come with labels attached. We impose our categories and live with the consequences. Rorty rehabilitated William James, declaring him a hero and a prophet. Suddenly William's pluralism, his anti-foundationalism, his insistence that philosophy should engage with life rather than retreat into technical puzzles, all this looked prescient instead of sloppy. The pragmatist revival accelerated. Hilary Putnam developed a sophisticated epistemology he called internal realism, arguing we can't make sense of truth independent of our conceptual schemes. Robert Brandom worked out a pragmatist theory of meaning based on social practices of giving and asking for reasons. Hugh Price applied pragmatist insights to debates about naturalism and representation. Cheryl Misak defended a pragmatist conception of truth that preserved objectivity without foundationalism. Contemporary pragmatism is diverse, technical, often quite different from what William wrote, but the core impulses remain. Philosophy should be continuous with the empirical inquiry, not separate from it. Ideas are tools, not mirrors. We can't escape our human perspective to judge it from nowhere. Pluralism is a fact we must accept, not a problem to solve. Outside academic philosophy, William's influence spread in unexpected directions. Cognitive science, a field that didn't exist in his lifetime, vindicated many of his hunches. The mind isn't a passive recorder but an active constructor. Perception involves interpretation. Attention shapes experience. Emotion and cognition interpenetrate. These are now standard views, confirmed by decades of experimental work. Mindfulness practices, imported from Buddhism but adapted to Western therapeutic contexts, echo William's phenomenological approach to consciousness. Paying attention to the stream of thought without judgment, observing how mental states arise and pass away, this is William's introspective method repurposed as mental health intervention. The psychology of religion, barely existent as a field when William wrote The Varieties, is now a thriving research area. Scientists study mystical experiences, religious conversion, the effects of prayer and meditation, using methods William would recognize. The questions he asked are being investigated empirically, producing data that sometimes confirms his insights, sometimes challenges them, always treating religious experience as a legitimate subject for scientific study. Even in physics, some theorists sound pragmatist notes. Carlo Rovelli writes about quantum mechanics in ways that emphasize relationality and perspective, arguing that properties are relative to observers and there's no view from nowhere. Lee Smolin defends the reality of time against physicists who treat it as illusory, making arguments that parallel William's insistence on taking change seriously. These aren't conscious borrowings from pragmatism, but the family resemblance is striking. What William opposed hasn't disappeared. Scientism, the belief that science provides the only genuine knowledge, remains influential. Reductionism, the attempt to explain higher-level phenomena entirely in terms of lower-level mechanisms, dominates much of neuroscience and cognitive science. Determinism, the view that free will is illusory, is probably the majority position among philosophers who specialize in the topic. But these views no longer go unchallenged. There's space now for pluralism, for multiple levels of explanation, for taking experience seriously, on its own terms. You can be a naturalist, committed to scientific method, without being a reductionist. You can believe in causation without denying agency. You can study consciousness empirically without explaining it away. This intellectual climate, more hospitable to ambiguity and complexity than the mid-20th century's passion for reduction and clarity, is partly William's legacy. Not because everyone reads him, most don't, but because the sensibility he represented has been vindicated. Reality is messier than our theories. Experience is richer than our concepts. The world doesn't divide neatly into categories we can specify in advance. The specific doctrines William defended have fared unevenly. His theory of truth, the claim that true beliefs are those that work, remains controversial. Critics say it conflates truth with usefulness, makes truth subjective, can't explain how beliefs can be useful, but false or true, but useless. Defenders respond that William was misunderstood, that he was analysing what we mean by calling beliefs true, not offering a criterion for determining truth. The debate continues, unresolved, probably unresolvable. His defence of free will hasn't convinced the determinists, but it shifted the conversation. Instead of asking whether determinism is true, philosophers now ask whether determinism would matter, whether we could still make sense of moral responsibility and rational agency in a determined world. This is a more productive question, one that doesn't depend on metaphysical speculation about causation. His radical empiricism, the view that relations are as real as things and should be taken as experiential data, influenced process philosophy and phenomenology, but never became mainstream. Most philosophers still think in terms of substances with properties, not pure experience organizing itself into patterns. But the alternative William sketched remains available, a road not taken that might still lead somewhere. The religious vision he articulated, pluralistic, experiential, suspicious of institutions and dogma, anticipated aspects of contemporary spirituality. The spiritual, but not religious phenomenon, people who seek meaning and transcendence outside traditional religious frameworks, would have made sense to William. He'd recognized the impulse, the hunger for something beyond the material, combined with distrust of authority and insistence on personal experience. Whether he'd approve is another question. William valued religious traditions, their accumulated wisdom, their ability to sustain communities and practices across generations. Pure individualism in religion can become narcissism, spirituality reduced to whatever makes you feel good. He knew that. He'd want the freedom to explore, but also the discipline of commitment, the willingness to let a tradition shape you instead of just picking what you like. This tension between individual and community, between freedom and commitment, runs through everything William wrote. He couldn't resolve it. Maybe it can't be resolved. Maybe it's the permanent human condition, the fact we're both separate and connected, both autonomous agents and social beings embedded in relationships and traditions. What William modelled was how to live with unresolved tensions, how to think rigorously without demanding premature closure, how to be serious about ideas without taking yourself too seriously. This is harder than it sounds. The temptation is always to simplify, to choose one side and reject the other, to build a system that explains everything at the cost of excluding whatever doesn't fit. William resisted that temptation his entire life. It made him a frustrating philosopher for readers who wanted clear answers and systematic theories. But it made him an honest one, faithful to experience in all its complexity and contradiction. His legacy isn't a doctrine, but an example. How to think, how to question, how to remain open to possibilities without losing critical judgment. How to take both science and religion seriously. How to be skeptical without being cynical. How to believe in truth while recognizing we never possess it completely. Human thought doesn't progress linearly. We don't solve problems once and for all, moving on to new ones. We circle back, rediscover old insights, fight battles we thought were finished. William's questions keep returning because they're our questions, permanent features of human existence rather than puzzles waiting for solutions. The question of free will and determinism won't go away. Neither will the mind-body problem, the nature of truth, the grounds for belief. William didn't settle these debates, but he changed how we approach them, insisting that abstract philosophical questions connect to concrete human concerns. Philosophy isn't a game played in seminar rooms. It's about how to live, what to value, how to make sense of a universe that doesn't come with instructions. His health never recovered after the crisis of 1898. The heart trouble that had forced him to retire from climbing mountains in Switzerland became chronic. By the early 1900s, he was struggling. Chest pain, shortness of breath, the sense that his body was betraying him. He kept working anyway, driven by the conviction that he hadn't yet said what needed saying. The Varieties of Religious Experience appeared in 1902, delivered as lectures in Edinburgh despite his declining physical state. Standing before audiences, speaking for hours, he pushed through the exhaustion and pain because the ideas mattered more than comfort. Pragmatism followed in 1907, another series of lectures that became his most popular book. He was simplifying, distilling decades of thought into accessible presentations. Some critics complained he was dumbing things down. They missed the point. Accessibility wasn't a compromise, it was the goal. Philosophy that can't be explained to intelligent non-specialists isn't deep, it's confused. A Pluralistic Universe came in 1909, his most metaphysical work, sketching a vision of reality as radically open, composed not of fixed substances, but of streams of experience flowing together and apart. It was speculative, tentative, full of qualifications and admissions that he might be wrong. This was William at his best, thinking aloud, inviting readers into the process rather than handing down conclusions from on high. The book confused many readers, it still does, but buried in its dense prose is a vision of genuine novelty, real creativity, a universe where the future isn't already determined and where human choices make an actual difference. Whether that vision is true remains an open question. William knew it. He was offering a possibility, not a proof. By 1910, his condition had worsened dramatically. The heart was failing. He knew death was approaching and he faced it with characteristic honesty. No pretense of courage he didn't feel. No false comfort from beliefs he couldn't sustain. He returned to the family summer home in Chocorua, New Hampshire, the place where he'd spent his happiest hours, surrounded by forests and mountains. Alice was with him. The children came and went. Henry arrived from England. The two brothers reconciled after years of subtle tension and competing for attention they'd never quite acknowledged. They talked. They remembered. They said what needed saying. On August 26th, 1910, William died in Alice's arms. He was 68 years old. His last words, according to Alice's account, were about his unfinished work, the ideas he hadn't yet developed, the books he wouldn't write. Even at the end, he was thinking forward, imagining possibilities. The obituaries praised him as America's greatest philosopher. They weren't wrong, but they simplified. William was never comfortable with greatness, never claimed to have discovered eternal truths. He saw himself as a fellow inquirer, someone asking questions alongside everyone else, distinguished only by his willingness to think carefully and honestly about them. The memorial services celebrated his contributions to psychology and philosophy. They emphasized his warm personality, his generosity to students, his infectious enthusiasm. These things mattered to William more than his publications. Ideas were important, but people were more important. Philosophy existed to help human beings live better lives, not to construct impressive systems. Henry outlived his brother by 6 years, dying in 1916. The two men had spent their lives in different worlds, literature and philosophy, fiction and argument. But they shared something fundamental, a conviction that attention matters, that how we see and describe experience shapes what we can know and who we can become. William's radical empiricism and Henry's psychological realism were different expressions of the same insight. Look closely, pay attention, don't simplify too quickly. Reality is richer than our categories. The William James who emerges from his letters and journals is more complicated than the confident public figure of the lectures and essays. He struggled with depression throughout his life, dark periods when everything seemed meaningless and death looked preferable to continued existence. The philosophical optimism, the pragmatic faith that life is worth living, was hard-won, maintained against internal resistance. This makes his affirmation of life more impressive, not less. Easy optimism from someone who's never doubted isn't worth much. Optimism chosen and sustained by someone who knows firsthand the arguments for despair, that's genuine. His relationship with his father remained unresolved. Henry James Sr. had died in 1882, still convinced that his children hadn't understood his theological vision, still disappointed that they'd gone their own ways instead of following his spiritual path. William inherited the religious questions without accepting the answers. The tension between them was never quite reconciled. Maybe it couldn't be. Children have to separate from parents, find their own paths. William did that, but he never stopped wrestling with his father's ghost, never stopped asking the religious and metaphysical questions that had consumed the elder Henry's life. His marriage to Alice was the anchor. She managed his affairs, protected his time, read his manuscripts, offered criticism he actually listened to. Without her practical support, he couldn't have produced what he did. This was typical of the era, wives providing invisible labour that enabled husbands' careers. William knew it. He acknowledged his dependence in letters, thanked her repeatedly, but he also took it for granted in ways that would trouble contemporary readers. The contradiction is instructive. We can recognise someone's genuine appreciation while also seeing the structural inequalities they didn't fully question. The question of William's contemporary relevance divides interpreters. Some argue he's been superseded, his psychology made obsolete by neuroscience, his philosophy too vague and literary for rigorous analysis. Others insist he's more relevant than ever, his pluralism and pragmatism offering resources for navigating contemporary complexity. Both perspectives miss something. William isn't relevant or irrelevant. He's a thinker who asks certain questions in particular ways, And those questions remain live even if his specific answers don't always convince. The neuroscience that's replaced introspective psychology hasn't answered the questions William cared most about. We know vastly more about brain mechanisms, neural correlates of consciousness, the biochemistry of emotion. None of this tells us what we should value, how we should live, whether free will is compatible with determinism. These are philosophical questions, not empirical ones. Science informs them, but can't resolve them. William understood this. He welcomed scientific investigation of mental phenomena while insisting that scientific description doesn't exhaust meaning. His pragmatism anticipated aspects of contemporary philosophy without being identical to them. Quine's naturalized epistemology, Rorty's neo-pragmatism, Putnam's internal realism all echo Jamesian themes while developing them in new directions. The rejection of armchair philosophy, the emphasis on practical consequences, the suspicion of grand metaphysical schemes, these are pragmatist commitments William helped establish. But contemporary pragmatists are more careful about relativism, more attentive to the social dimensions of knowledge, less individualistic in their focus. William's thought was a beginning, not a final word. The varieties of religious experience he catalogued remain recognizable. People still have mystical encounters, conversion experiences, dark nights of the soul. The psychological patterns William identified persist across cultures and historical periods, but the interpretive frameworks have multiplied. We now recognize influences he didn't consider: trauma, cultural conditioning, neurological conditions that can produce religious-seeming experiences. This doesn't invalidate his phenomenology, it complicates it. The experiences are real. Their sources and meanings are more contested than William acknowledged. His temperamental distinction between tough-minded and tender-minded thinkers still rings true. Some people are drawn to hard facts, scientific rigor, skeptical questioning. Others are drawn to meaning, beauty, spiritual possibility. The division isn't absolute. Most of us contain both impulses in varying proportions. But the tension William identified is real, a permanent feature of human diversity rather than a problem to be solved. Philosophy that speaks only to one temperament will alienate the other. William tried to do justice to both, acknowledging facts while leaving room for hopes. The radical empiricism he developed late in life was probably his most original contribution. The idea that relations are as real as things, that experience comes as a continuous flow rather than discrete atomic sensations. This challenged the entire empiricist tradition from Locke through Hume and Mill. They'd all assumed that experience gives us separate impressions that mind then combines. William argued we experience connections directly, that togetherness and apartness, before and after, cause and effect, are given in experience just as much as colours and sounds. This was revolutionary. It meant we don't need to explain how mind constructs a world from scattered sense data. The world comes already organised, already meaningful, though we can analyse and reorganise it in thought. Few philosophers followed him down this path. The radical empiricism was too strange, too hard to integrate with standard philosophical frameworks. But it influenced literature and psychology in unexpected ways. Stream of consciousness as a literary technique, the attempt to capture thought's continuous flow rather than imposing artificial structure that was Jamesian. Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, the entire modernist movement in fiction was doing in literature what William had tried to do in philosophy, taking experience as it comes rather than forcing it into conventional categories. His influence on education was subtler but pervasive. John Dewey, the great educational reformer, was William's student and friend. Dewey's progressive education, emphasizing experience over rote learning, activity over passive reception, problem solving over memorization, all reflected pragmatist principles William had articulated. The idea that education should prepare students for life, rather than fill them with facts, that learning happens through doing, that genuine understanding requires active engagement. These are Jamesian commitments. They're now so widely accepted we forget they were once controversial. The stream of thought, William's phrase for consciousness's continuous flow, replaced the older model of discrete ideas succeeding one another. This seems obvious now. Of course, thinking is continuous, each thought blending into the next. But it wasn't obvious to earlier psychologists who tried to analyze consciousness into separate elements. William's metaphor changed how we talk and think about mental life. Before him, psychologists spoke of ideas, sensations, associations. After him, they spoke of processes, flows, streams. The change in metaphor was a change in understanding. His 2-volume Principles of Psychology, published in 1890, was the textbook that defined the field for a generation. It's still readable, still insightful, though the specific theories have been superseded. What makes it endure isn't the data or the experimental results. It's the descriptions, the phenomenology, the careful attention to what experience actually feels like. William could describe the tip-of-the-tongue phenomenon, the sense of knowing a word without being able to recall it, in ways that made readers recognize their own experience. This is rare. Most psychology reduces experience to mechanisms. William preserved the experience while explaining it. The question of whether pragmatism is a theory of truth or a theory of meaning has never been settled. William sometimes wrote as if truth is what works, as if beliefs become true by proving useful. This sounds like relativism, like truth is whatever we want it to be. Other times he wrote more carefully, saying pragmatism is a method for clarifying meanings, a way to cash out abstract concepts in terms of practical consequences. This is less controversial. It's just asking what difference an idea makes. Both strands run through his work, sometimes in the same essay. Critics pounced on the ambiguity. Defenders tried to clean it up, pick one interpretation, and reject the other. William himself never chose. He seemed to think both were true or true enough, or true in different contexts. This refusal to choose, to commit to a single clear position, frustrated readers then and now, but it might be the most honest response. Truth is both discovered and made, both objective and interest relative. Pure objectivism, the view that truth is completely independent of human concerns, makes truth irrelevant. Pure relativism, the view that truth is whatever we decide, makes truth meaningless. We live between these extremes, trying to be faithful to reality while acknowledging our descriptions are shaped by purposes and perspectives. William inhabited that between space more comfortably than most philosophers. His personal warmth comes through the letters. He wrote to friends, students, colleagues with enthusiasm and encouragement. He praised their work, offered suggestions, stayed connected across years and distances. The generosity wasn't strategic. He genuinely cared about people, wanted them to succeed, took pleasure in their accomplishments. This made him beloved. Students remembered him decades later with affection. Colleagues who disagreed with his philosophy still valued his friendship. The combination of intellectual brilliance and human kindness is rarer than it should be. Now William's work enters a different phase, spreading beyond philosophy into wider culture, becoming part of the permanent conversation about who we are and how we should live. The Varieties of Religious Experience appeared in 1902 and changed how we think about faith. William delivered it first as the Gifford Lectures in Edinburgh, a prestigious series on natural theology. The audience expected philosophical arguments about God's existence. They got something entirely different. William approached religion the way he approached consciousness, not through doctrine or institutions, but through experience itself. He collected hundreds of first-hand accounts, conversions, mystical visions, moments of grace, experiences of divine presence. He treated them as data, phenomena to be described and understood, rather than dismissed or explained away. The method was radical. Previous philosophers of religion had focused on arguments. Does the cosmological argument work? Can we prove God from design? William set all that aside. Arguments don't create faith, experience does. Someone who has felt the presence of God doesn't need proofs. Someone who hasn't won't be convinced by them. What interested him was the transformation religious experience produces. People's lives change. The drunk becomes sober. The despairing find hope. The selfish discover compassion. These changes are real, measurable, consequential. Whether God exists in some metaphysical sense mattered less to William than whether religious experience produces better lives. This shocked theologians. It delighted skeptics. Neither response quite captured what he was doing. He wasn't reducing religion to psychology. He was taking religious experience seriously on its own terms while remaining uncommitted to any particular theological interpretation. A mystic reports union with the divine. William describes the phenomenology, the feeling of boundaries dissolving, of merging with something infinitely larger than the self. He notes this experience appears across cultures and traditions. Then he asks what difference it makes. How does it change the person who has it? Does it produce insight, compassion, peace? The healthy-minded versus sick-soul distinction became one of his most influential ideas. Some people are naturally optimistic, finding good in everything, troubled by nothing. They experience religion as celebration, gratitude for a beautiful world. Others are constitutionally melancholic, aware of suffering and evil, unable to ignore life's darkness. They experience religion as redemption, rescue from a fallen world. Neither type is better. They're different temperaments with different spiritual needs. The healthy-minded need affirmation. The sick souls need transformation. Religious traditions accommodate both. Some emphasize joy and abundance. Others emphasize suffering and salvation. William himself leaned toward the sick soul side. He knew depression, anxiety, the sense that something fundamental was wrong. His own religious sensibility was shaped by that darkness and the need to find meaning despite it. The mystical experience chapters remain the book's core. William identified 4 marks of mysticism. Ineffability, the experience defies description. Noetic quality, it feels like knowledge, revelation, insight into truth. Transiency, it doesn't last, fading quickly, though its effects endure. Passivity, the person feels taken over, moved by something beyond voluntary control. He collected accounts from saints, poets, ordinary people, Teresa of Avila, Meister Eckhart, Whitman, anonymous testimonies from revival meetings. The descriptions vary, but the pattern holds. Boundaries dissolve. The sense of separate self disappears. Everything becomes connected, meaningful, luminous, with significance. Time stops or becomes eternal. The person feels utterly certain this is reality, that ordinary consciousness is the illusion. Then it fades. The person returns to normal awareness, but changed, carrying the memory of something that felt more real than anything else. William didn't claim these experiences prove anything about ultimate reality. He did claim they're real experiences with real effects. Ignoring them because they don't fit materialist assumptions is bad science. His own experiments with nitrous oxide appear in the book. Laughing gas produces brief mystical states, feelings of cosmic unity and profound insight. William inhaled it repeatedly, trying to capture the insights in writing. What he wrote while intoxicated looked like gibberish afterward, but the feeling of having grasped ultimate truth was overwhelming in the moment. This didn't make him dismiss mystical experience as mere chemistry. It showed that chemistry and consciousness are deeply connected. The that altered brain states can produce genuine experiences. Whether those experiences reveal metaphysical truth or just demonstrate the brain's capacities, he left open. The book's reception was remarkable. It became a bestseller, translated into dozens of languages, read far beyond academic circles. Believers found validation. William took their experiences seriously instead of explaining them away. Skeptics found permission to respect religious experience without accepting religious doctrine. You could appreciate the psychological and moral value of faith without committing to supernatural claims. Some critics accused him of reducing religion to feeling, of ignoring truth claims and institutional structures. Others said he was too sympathetic, unwilling to expose religious belief as delusion. Both criticisms missed the point. He wasn't defending or attacking religion. He was describing it, showing what it does to and for people, letting the phenomena speak. The pragmatic approach appears throughout. Judge beliefs by their fruits. Does this faith make the person better? More loving? More courageous? More at peace? Then it's working. Does it produce cruelty, rigidity, fear? Then something's wrong, regardless of doctrinal correctness. This offended both religious authorities who insisted on correct belief and secular critics who wanted to debunk all faith. His personal position remained deliberately ambiguous. He called himself a believer, but refused to specify what he believed. God exists in some sense, he thought. The universe has a spiritual dimension. We're connected to something larger than ourselves. But the details, the specific doctrines any tradition claims as essential, those he held lightly. This wasn't fence-sitting. It was intellectual honesty. He found religious experience compelling but theology unconvincing. He respected faith but distrusted institutions. He wanted to preserve what was valuable in religion while remaining open to naturalistic explanations. The tension never resolved. Perhaps it shouldn't. By this point, William was famous, recognized everywhere, in demand as a speaker. The life of a public intellectual exhausted him. He craved solitude, time to think and write without interruption. But the lectures and correspondence and social obligations multiplied. Everyone wanted his attention, his endorsement, his participation in their projects. Alice managed much of this, protecting his time, filtering requests, making their home a refuge. Without her, he would have collapsed under the weight of obligation. She understood his need for both connection and withdrawal, for engagement with the world and retreat from it. Their partnership was the foundation that made everything else possible. The question of free will never left him. He'd staked his recovery on it decades earlier, choosing to believe he could choose. Now, with a lifetime of experience behind him, what did he think? The technical philosophical problem remained unsolved. Determinism and free will seemed incompatible, yet both seemed true. Every action has causes, yet we experience ourselves as agents making real choices. His solution, characteristically, was to live in the tension. Theoretically, he couldn't prove free will exists. Practically, he had to assume it does. When deliberating about what to do, you can't help treating the future as open, your choice as real. Determinism might be true from the universe's perspective. From the inside, living forward, we're free. This satisfied almost no one. Determinists wanted him to admit freedom is illusion. Libertarians wanted him to prove determinism false. He did neither, insisting both perspectives capture something true, that the conflict arises from trying to take a view from nowhere, outside the flow of lived experience, where choices actually happen. His health declined through his 60s. The heart condition worsened. Fatigue became constant. He continued working, but more slowly, with longer periods of rest. Friends worried. Alice worried. He tried to cut back on commitments, but couldn't refuse everything. The work mattered too much. A final trip to Europe in 1908 and 1909 was meant to restore him. He visited England, France, Italy, seeing old friends, giving lectures, trying to rest. The travelling exhausted him. He came home weaker than when he'd left. Still, he worked on the book that would become Some Problems of Philosophy, his attempt at a systematic statement of his metaphysical views. The writing came hard. He'd always been a brilliant stylist, but unsystematic, developing ideas through essays and lectures rather than building comprehensive theories. Now he wanted to lay it all out, answer the big questions about reality, knowledge, truth. The effort drained him. Spring 1910 brought deterioration. His heart failed more often. Breathing became difficult. He knew he was dying. The knowledge didn't panic him. He'd thought about death his whole life, written about it, helped others face it. Now it was his turn. In late August, he travelled to their summer home in Chocorua, New Hampshire, the place he loved most, surrounded by mountains and forest. He was too weak to walk far, but sat on the porch, looking at the hills, reading, sometimes writing a few lines. Alice stayed beside him. Their children came. There were quiet conversations, moments of peace. The pain increased. Morphine helped. His mind remained clear when he wanted it to be, drifting when he let it. On August 26, 1910, with Alice holding his hand, William James died. He was 68 years old. The last entry in his notebook, written days earlier, read simply, "There is no conclusion. What has concluded that we might conclude in regard to it?" The funeral was small, private. Burial in Cambridge near his parents. No grand memorial service. He'd wanted simplicity. Friends and colleagues wrote tributes. Students shared memories. The philosophical community mourned. But the real measure of his impact would take decades to emerge. His influence spread in unexpected directions. Psychology continued developing along lines he'd sketched, though behaviorism would soon dominate, rejecting introspection and consciousness as unscientific. That reaction against his methods wouldn't last. Cognitive psychology in the 1960s would return to studying mental processes, vindicating his insistence that consciousness matters. Pragmatism became an American philosophical movement, developed by Dewey and others into a comprehensive worldview. The emphasis on practical consequences, on testing ideas through action, on treating truth as connected to inquiry rather than static correspondence, these themes shaped American intellectual life for generations. Religious studies embraced his phenomenological approach. Scholars began studying religious experience across traditions, taking first-person accounts seriously, bracketing questions of ultimate truth to focus on what faith does for believers. The field he created continues thriving. His writing style influenced how philosophy gets done. Before William, philosophical prose was often dense, technical, inaccessible. He showed you could be rigorous and readable, profound and clear. Not every philosopher followed his example, but the possibility was established. Ideas should be communicable, not locked in specialist jargon. The tensions in his work never resolved, because they're real tensions in how we think about ourselves. We're animals evolved through natural selection, yet we experience ourselves as free agents making meaningful choices. We're physical systems obeying natural law, yet we have inner lives, subjective experiences that seem irreducible to mechanism. We want truth independent of our desires, yet our interests shape what we investigate and how we interpret results. William didn't solve these tensions. He lived them, thought through them, refused to pretend they don't exist. That honesty is his gift. We're still working through the problems he identified, still trying to understand consciousness, freedom, truth, faith. His voice remains in the conversation, asking good questions, warning against premature conclusions, insisting we stay true to the full complexity of experience. What would he make of contemporary neuroscience, with its brain scans and neural correlates of consciousness? He'd be fascinated, eager to learn, quick to see implications. But he'd warn against reducing everything to brain activity, against thinking we've explained experience by mapping its physical basis. The hard problem remains. Why is there something it's like to be conscious? Why doesn't all this neural activity happen in the dark? And contemporary physics, quantum mechanics, relativity, the strange picture of reality emerging from fundamental science, he'd love it. The universe is weirder than common sense suggests. Matter isn't solid. Time isn't absolute. Observer and observed are entangled. These discoveries vindicate his suspicion that metaphysical questions stay open, that reality exceeds our categories. His legacy is permission to think freely, to follow inquiry wherever it leads, to respect both scientific rigor and lived experience, to hold contradictions in tension rather than forcing premature resolution. This approach feels more necessary than ever in our polarized moment when everyone demands you choose sides, commit to a position, reject alternatives. William shows another way. Stay curious, stay humble, follow the evidence but don't ignore what evidence can't capture. Be systematic but not rigid. Value truth but recognize our truths are provisional, partial, perspective dependent. Live forward, think backward, remain open to revision. The stream of consciousness flows on, different in each person, connected to every other stream through shared world and mutual influence. We're all thinking together, building understanding collectively, each contributing our piece to an endless collaborative inquiry. That was his vision and his practice, and it remains the best hope for genuine progress in understanding ourselves and everything else. The house on Irving Street became a gathering place for Harvard's intellectual elite, but Alice's condition meant visitors often found William distracted, exhausted, managing a household while teaching full course loads. Students noticed he sometimes arrived at lectures having barely slept. The cost of his devotion showed in his face, the deepening lines, the weariness behind his eyes. In 1907 he published Pragmatism, the book that would make his philosophy accessible to general readers. Based on lectures delivered at Columbia and Harvard, it presented pragmatism not as a system, but as a method, a way of settling metaphysical disputes by tracing practical consequences. The book became a bestseller by academic standards, thrust him into public prominence, made pragmatism a cultural movement beyond philosophy departments. But success brought exhaustion. His heart condition worsened. Doctors ordered rest. He resigned from Harvard in 1907, ending a 35-year teaching career, hoping to focus on writing, to finally complete the comprehensive philosophical work he'd been planning for decades. Alice's death came in 1909, after years of invalidism, years of William organising his life around her needs. She died quietly. The grief was profound, but also complicated. He'd been her caretaker so long that her absence created a terrible void, while simultaneously lifting an immense burden. Guilt and relief mingled unbearably. His own health collapsed further. Heart problems intensified. He could barely walk without pain, struggled to climb stairs, spent days in bed recovering from minor exertion. Friends worried. His children watched their father, once so vigorous, become frail. In 1910, seeking treatment, he travelled to Europe one final time. He consulted specialists in Germany, tried various therapies, hoped for improvement. Nothing worked. By summer, he knew he was dying. He wanted to go home. The journey back across the Atlantic was agony. Every movement hurt. He could barely eat, but he was determined to die in America, in the house on Irving Street, surrounded by his things, his books, his family. The ship docked in late August. They transported him home carefully, settled him into bed. He lingered for a few days, drifting in and out of consciousness. His children took turns sitting with him. There's a photograph from those final days showing him in bed, gaunt, hollow-cheeked, but his eyes still intelligent, still aware. On August 26, 1910, he died. He was 68 years old. The official cause was heart disease, but really it was exhaustion. The accumulated toll of a life lived at full intensity, always pushing, always thinking, never resting. The funeral was simple. Colleagues spoke about his influence, his generosity, his revolutionary contributions to psychology and philosophy. Students remembered his kindness, his willingness to take them seriously, his infectious enthusiasm for ideas. The academic world mourned, but the grief was broader than that. William had become a public intellectual, someone ordinary educated people read and discussed. His death felt like a loss to the culture, not just the profession. They buried him in Cambridge Cemetery, not far from the house where he'd spent his final years. The grave is marked with a simple stone, no elaborate monument, nothing grandiose. He would have approved. In his final months, he'd been working on a manuscript that would be published posthumously as Some Problems of Philosophy. It remained unfinished, breaking off mid-argument. The incompleteness feels appropriate somehow. His philosophy was always provisional, always in process, never claiming final answers. What did he accomplish across those 68 years? He helped create psychology as a scientific discipline, wrote the textbook that defined the field, established consciousness as a legitimate object of study. He developed pragmatism into a rigorous philosophical method, changed how we think about truth, meaning, belief. He defended religious faith against scientific reductionism without abandoning naturalism. He insisted on free will while respecting determinism. He held contradictions in tension rather than resolving them prematurely. But maybe his deepest accomplishment was showing how to think, demonstrating through practice that intellectual honesty means staying open, following evidence, resisting dogma, admitting uncertainty, valuing lived experience alongside abstract theory. He made philosophy feel human again, connected to actual life rather than trapped in academic abstractions. His influence spread through students who became influential themselves. John Dewey developed pragmatism into a comprehensive philosophy of education and democracy. William's emphasis on experience shaped Dewey's conviction that learning happens through doing, that education should prepare students for active citizenship, that philosophy must engage social problems. Bertrand Russell, despite disagreeing with pragmatism, acknowledged William's impact on how philosophy gets practiced. The conversational style, the willingness to use ordinary examples, the clarity of exposition, these became more common after William showed they were compatible with serious thought. Phenomenology, the European movement studying consciousness and experience, developed independently but shared William's commitment to describing phenomena as they appear rather than explaining them away. Edmund Husserl and William never met, but they were working similar territory, approaching consciousness with similar respect for its complexity. American culture absorbed his ideas in diffused form. The can-do optimism, the pragmatic problem-solving, the suspicion of abstract theory disconnected from practice. These national traits found philosophical articulation in William's work. He gave Americans a philosophy that felt like theirs, rooted in their temperament and values. Religious liberals embraced his defense of faith. If religion's value lies in its effects on life, in the transformation it produces, then you can be intellectually honest and spiritually committed simultaneously. This opened space for educated believers, uncomfortable with fundamentalism, but unwilling to abandon faith entirely. Psychology departments continued teaching his principles long after specific theories were superseded. The emphasis on function over structure, on studying consciousness in its natural complexity, on respecting subjective experience, these methodological commitments shaped the discipline's development. Even behaviorists rejecting introspection as unscientific were reacting against the tradition William established. His personal qualities mattered as much as his ideas. Students remembered his encouragement, his ability to make them feel their thoughts mattered, his refusal to dismiss ideas just because they came from unconventional sources. He created an intellectual atmosphere of openness, curiosity, mutual respect that influenced how teaching gets done. The letters he wrote, thousands of them across decades, reveal someone deeply engaged with others' lives and thoughts. He responded to strangers' questions, encouraged young thinkers, maintained friendships across continents, used correspondence as a way of thinking through problems. The intellectual community he helped create was personal, warm, collaborative, rather than competitive. His relationship with Henry remained complicated until the end. They never fully understood each other. Henry's novels seemed to William unnecessarily complex, too focused on subtle psychological nuance. William's philosophy seemed to Henry too eager to simplify, too quick to reach conclusions. But they loved each other, maintained contact, supported each other's work, even when they didn't fully appreciate it. After William's death, Henry edited a collection of his letters, writing a biographical introduction that captures something essential about his brother. Henry describes William's vitality, his generosity, his inability to be boring, his gift for making ideas feel alive. The portrait is loving but honest, acknowledging William's faults alongside his virtues. The 20th century vindicated some of William's positions while undermining others. Behaviorism dominated psychology for decades, rejecting introspection entirely, treating consciousness as irrelevant to scientific study. This seemed like a repudiation of everything William stood for. But behaviorism eventually gave way to cognitive psychology, which brought mental processes back into focus, acknowledged that understanding mind requires studying subjective experience alongside objective behaviour. The pendulum swung back toward William's approach. Neuroscience emerged as the dominant framework for studying consciousness, mapping brain activity, identifying neural correlates of experience. This fulfills William's hope for rigorous scientific study of mind, while raising the hard problem he identified. We can map every neuron, trace every chemical signal, and still the question remains, why is there something it's like to be conscious? Why doesn't all this activity happen in darkness? The explanatory gap, he noticed, hasn't closed. Pragmatism experienced a revival in the late 20th century through philosophers like Richard Rorty and Hilary Putnam. They returned to William's texts, found resources for addressing contemporary problems, demonstrated that his approach remains fruitful. The revival wasn't simple repetition, but creative development, taking his ideas in directions he didn't anticipate, but that follow from his principles. His defense of religious belief remains controversial. Atheists argue he gave intellectual cover to irrational faith, that making truth dependent on consequences opens the door to wishful thinking. Believers argue he reduced religion to psychology, stripped away transcendent claims, left only therapeutic value. Both criticisms miss his nuance. He wasn't saying, believe whatever feels good, or that religion is merely useful fiction. He was arguing that religious experience provides evidence, that transformation testifies to something real, that dismissing this evidence because it's subjective is arbitrary. The question he posed persists. If we're thoroughgoing naturalists, if humans are evolved animals in a physical universe, how do we account for consciousness, meaning, value, freedom? Reductionism seems to follow logically, yet lived experience contradicts it. We can't help experiencing ourselves as free, our choices as meaningful, our values as more than preference. William refused to deny either side, insisted we hold both in tension, keep thinking through the problem rather than pretending it's solved. His style of philosophizing feels increasingly relevant in our fragmented moment. Academic philosophy has has become hyper-specialized, divided into subdisciplines with their own jargon and concerns, often inaccessible to educated general readers. William represents an alternative, rigorous but readable, technical when necessary but always aiming for clarity, willing to address big questions without apology. The current crisis in academia, where humanities departments shrink and philosophy seems increasingly marginal, might be addressed by recovering William's public engagement. He showed philosophy can matter beyond universities, can illuminate lived experience, can help people think through personal and social problems. That requires writing and teaching differently, prioritizing communication over specialized credentialing, but the model exists in his work. Consciousness studies, now an interdisciplinary field combining neuroscience, philosophy, psychology, and contemplative traditions, continues pursuing questions William identified. Conferences bring together researchers studying meditation, psychedelics, split brain patients, artificial intelligence, all trying to understand what consciousness is and how it relates to physical processes. The hard problem he named frames much of this inquiry. Proposed solutions multiply, but none achieve consensus, suggesting he was right that this problem resists easy resolution. His pluralism, his insistence that multiple frameworks can be valid simultaneously, that different temperaments require different philosophies, resonates in our multicultural moment. We're increasingly aware that Western philosophy isn't the only game in town, that other traditions offer genuine insight, that intellectual humility means recognizing our perspective's limitations. William's openness to diverse viewpoints, his willingness to learn from unexpected sources, models an approach we desperately need. The stream keeps flowing. New thoughts emerge, old thoughts fade, consciousness continues its endless movement. Each generation faces the same fundamental questions in new circumstances. What are we? How should we live? What can we know? What should we hope for? William didn't answer these questions definitively because they can't be answered definitively, but he showed how to approach them honestly, rigorously, humanely, staying true to both scientific insight and lived experience, following inquiry wherever it leads, while remaining humble about conclusions. His grave in Cambridge sees occasional visitors. Students studying psychology or philosophy make pilgrimages, stand quietly, reflect on this man who helped create their disciplines. The stone is weathered now, over a century of New England seasons wearing at the inscription. But the ideas remain fresh, the questions urgent, the method exemplary. He left us not a system to memorize, but an approach to embody. Not final answers, but better questions. Not certainty, but honest uncertainty, combined with determination to keep thinking, keep inquiring, keep pushing toward understanding, even knowing we'll never fully arrive. That's enough. That's everything. The work continues without him, but bearing his influence, shaped by his example, animated by his conviction that ideas matter, that thinking carefully about hard questions is worth the effort, that intellectual honesty, combined with openness to experience, offers our best hope for progress. The stream flows on, standing in that laboratory in 1890, staring at preserved brain tissue. William James couldn't have imagined where his questions would lead. He died believing his work incomplete, his systematic philosophy unfinished, his most important insights not yet properly expressed. He was wrong about that. The incompleteness was the point. Philosophy doesn't progress through final solutions. It progresses through better questions, clearer formulations, more honest acknowledgement of what we don't know. William gave us that. Not a system to defend, but a method to practice. Not dogma, but inquiry. Not certainty, but rigorous uncertainty, combined with determination to keep thinking. The man who couldn't choose between art and science ended up showing the choice was false. The young depressive who experimented with free will by deciding to believe in it created a philosophy where belief and action interpenetrate, where choosing shapes reality rather than merely revealing it. The psychologist who described consciousness as a stream influenced novelists as much as scientists. The philosopher who wrote for ordinary readers changed how technical philosophy gets practiced. Every tension in his thought reflected genuine tension in existence. We are both determined and free, material and conscious, individuals and social beings, observers and participants. Resolving these contradictions requires denying aspects of experience we can't honestly deny. Better to live in the tension, think through it carefully, resist premature closure. Contemporary debates replay his arguments with new terminology. Neuroscientists map consciousness, while philosophers ask why mapping explains anything. Psychologists study well-being while questioning whether science can address meaning. Educators balance skills training against wisdom cultivation. Religious believers navigate between fundamentalism and secular dismissal. These are William's territories, the problems he identified and worked through without pretending to solve definitively. His temperament matters as much as his theories. The generosity toward other viewpoints, the willingness to learn from unexpected sources, the ability to take ideas seriously without taking himself too seriously. These qualities feel desperately needed. Our polarized moment demands choosing sides, committing to positions, rejecting alternatives. William modeled something different. Stay curious, follow evidence, respect experience, hold contradictions, keep inquiring. The stream of thought he described flows through all of us, different in each person, but connected through shared world and mutual influence. We think together whether we know it or not, building understanding collectively, each contributing fragments toward comprehension that remains forever incomplete. That was his vision. Not individual genius solving problems, but collaborative inquiry advancing through honest effort. Psychology became a science partly through his work, but also moved beyond him, discovered things he never imagined, corrected his errors, built on his foundations. Philosophy developed pragmatism in directions he didn't anticipate, argued with his formulations, preserved his core insights while transforming their expression. This is how intellectual progress works, not through timeless truths, but through generations building on and revising what came before. His grave sits quietly in Cambridge. The inscription offers no grand claims, no philosophical pronouncements, just name and dates. Nearby, students walk to classes at Harvard, some studying psychology, some philosophy. Most unaware, they're passing the resting place of someone who helped create their fields. That anonymity would please him. Ideas matter more than credit. Understanding matters more than fame. The work continues with or without recognition. What remains isn't a doctrine, but an example. How to think carefully about hard questions. How to respect both scientific rigor and lived experience. How to be systematic without being rigid, skeptical without being cynical, committed without being dogmatic. How to write philosophy that matters to people, actually living lives rather than just academic scoring points. The unfinished manuscript on his desk when he died captured something essential. Philosophy never finishes. New questions emerge from every answer. Reality exceeds our categories. Experience outstrips our theories. The best we can do is think carefully, describe honestly, remain open to revision, keep inquiring. That laboratory moment in 1890, consciousness confronting itself through brain tissue and philosophical perplexity, contains everything. The mystery of awareness, the puzzle of how matter produces mind, the question of whether thoughts are real or just chemical reactions. We're still there, still puzzled, still seeking understanding. William showed us how to inhabit that uncertainty productively, how to make it generative rather than paralyzing. The stream keeps flowing. Your consciousness right now, attending to these words, forming responses, connecting ideas, Experiencing itself experiencing? That's the phenomenon William spent a lifetime trying to understand. He didn't solve it. Nobody has. But he described it more carefully than almost anyone, respected its complexity, refused to explain it away, insisted we take it seriously on its own terms. His final question, written days before death, asked what conclusion we can reach about something that has already concluded. The question contains its own answer. We can't step outside the stream to judge it from nowhere. We're always inside, thinking forward, making sense as we go, provisional and perspectival and human. That's not a limitation to overcome, but our condition to accept. Philosophy that forgets this becomes empty formalism, logic games disconnected from life. Science that forgets this becomes crude reductionism, explaining away what matters most. Religion that forgets this becomes rigid dogma, certainty without understanding. William kept all three honest, kept them connected to lived experience, kept them serving human flourishing rather than just intellectual ambition. The questions he asked remain our questions. What are we? How should we live? What can we know? What should we hope for? The answers keep changing as knowledge accumulates and circumstances shift, but the questions persist because they're built into conscious existence itself. As long as awareness exists wondering about itself, these problems will need thinking through again and again. That's William's true legacy. Not solutions, but the demonstration that inquiry itself is worthwhile, that thinking carefully about fundamental questions matters even when final answers elude us. That intellectual honesty combined with openness to experience offers our best hope for understanding. The work continues, the stream flows on. Consciousness keeps confronting its own mystery. We're all William students whether we know it or not, inheritors of his conviction that examined life is worth living, that attention matters, that reality rewards patient inquiry even when it withholds final certainty. He left us permission to think freely, courage to question deeply, and humility to revise constantly. In a world demanding allegiance to fixed positions, that gift becomes more precious with each passing year. The conversation continues, the inquiry progresses, understanding deepens incrementally through collective effort. William showed the way by walking it himself, honestly and generously, leaving footprints others could follow toward questions that never exhaust themselves, because consciousness itself never stops wondering what it is and what it means. That wondering, that ceaseless inquiry, that refusal to stop asking, that's the inheritance. The rest is just details.